My name is Warren Gallagher. At 66, my hands still bear the distinct, rough calluses of a man who spent 4 decades pulling himself up from the absolute bottom. There is a particular texture to a life built on physical labor, a history etched into the skin that no amount of wealth or comfort can ever erase. My empire was not born in a boardroom. It was forged in the sweltering, unforgiving summers of Western Sydney. I spent my youth pouring concrete for foundation after foundation, negotiating ruthless land deals, and working 70-hour weeks while others were still asleep. I did not inherit a single cent from anyone. Everything I own, every brick in my portfolio, and every lesson I hold dear was purchased with iron willpower and the relentless pursuit of integrity. When my wife passed away 4 years ago, the silence that descended upon our home in the leafy, prestigious suburb of Vaucluse was entirely deafening. It was not a peaceful quiet. It was an agonizing void that echoed through the hallways of a house that had become too large for one person. I found myself wandering from room to room, trapped in the scent of her perfume that lingered in the curtains, desperately seeking a way to feel useful again. In my grief, I made the mistake that many men of my generation make. I mistook financial provision for paternal guidance. I thought I could fill that void by pouring my life, my resources, and my undivided attention into our only son, Lachlan. Lachlan is a newly licensed dermatologist. He's a young man who was born on third base, but has spent his entire adult life entirely convinced that he hit a triple. I made certain he never had to endure the grueling summer heat or the back-breaking exhaustion of a labor-intensive job. I ensured his expensive medical school tuition at the University of Sydney was paid entirely in cash, leaving him with the unearned luxury of graduating without the crushing, suffocating weight of student debt. At the time, I believed this was a father's greatest gift, a clean slate. I wanted him to focus entirely on his craft, to excel without the distractions of the struggle I had endured. That, I now realize, was my first and greatest mistake. I had removed the friction from his life, and in doing so, I had stripped away the very thing that builds character. Comfort breeds a very specific type of weakness, and in Lachlan's case, it nurtured a dangerous, deep-seated entitlement. He did not grow up watching the concrete set. He grew up watching the results of it. He began to view the fruits of my labor as his birthright, a natural extension of his own existence rather than a product of sacrifice. He became a man who understood the price of nothing and the value of everything, a disconnect that would eventually lead us to the precipice. Sitting here now, in my quiet office overlooking the city skyline, I realized that the silence I was trying to escape was not the enemy. The real enemy was the hollow echo of a son who had forgotten how to listen to the lessons of the past. The stage for our inevitable collision had been set long before the first dollar was transferred. If Lachlan was the product of my misplaced benevolence, then his wife, Isla, was the catalyst that accelerated his descent into vanity. Isla was the perfect embodiment of that specific weakness I had inadvertently cultivated in my son. From a moment she entered our lives, she seemed to view my wealth not as a foundation for a professional career, but as a perpetual subsidy for a lifestyle that demanded constant, uninterrupted luxury. She possessed the financial literacy of a spoiled child, yet her ego demanded the respect of a seasoned corporate magnate. Every Sunday evening, they would arrive at my home in Vaucluse, and the atmosphere would shift palpably. I would sit at the head of the dining table, often still wearing the faded flannel shirts and worn leather boots that were the remnants of my working life. Isla would look at my attire with barely concealed disgust, her gaze lingering on my calloused hands as if they were a stain on the polished marble of her reality. She treated me not as a grieving father, but as a blue-collar relic, an inconvenient grandfather figure who happened to be holding the golden keys to their upper-class existence. She would steer every conversation toward the latest trends in the Sydney social circuit, the exclusivity of private clubs in Double Bay, and the necessity of maintaining an image that cost more than I had earned in my first 5 years of labor. I tolerated these endless, subtle insults because I was blinded by a father's desperate hope. I ignored the way Lachlan would carelessly check his phone for social media notifications while I attempted to offer him genuine business advice, rooted in decades of navigating the volatile Australian real estate market. I truly believe that if I provided them with a massive, prime commercial asset to launch a dermatology practice in the heart of the Double Bay Medical Precinct, it would secure Lachlan's professional future and, perhaps, keep our fractured family together. I wanted to build a legacy, not realizing that I was simply constructing a pedestal for their arrogance. Isla appointed herself the clinic administrator the very moment I agreed to fund their medical venture. She had no experience in managing medical billing, regulatory compliance, or operational overhead, but she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never known a day of professional failure. She viewed the project as an exercise in vanity rather than a business. She would talk about aesthetic curation and atmospheric brand synergy, while I was concerned with procurement costs, leasehold improvements, and long-term solvency. I watched them drift further away from the realities of work, living in a bubble of perceived prestige. They treated my capital as a bottomless reservoir, never stopping to consider the fact that every cent of that $900,000 injection had been earned in the freezing, early morning rain of a life they would never understand. I was not investing in a clinic. I was financing the very entities that would soon seek to discard me. I was the silent benefactor of a theater production, yet I had no idea how quickly the script would turn against its producer. In the world of commercial real estate, a handshake is merely a formality. The contract is the only truth. Because I'm a businessman who survived the brutal economic shifts of the Australian market, I knew that family dynamics have no place in a venture of this magnitude. When the time came to formalize the funding for the Double Bay Clinic, I insisted on a formal structure. I engaged my longtime legal counsel to draft an 80-page limited liability company formation document. It was not merely a charter. It was a comprehensive senior secured loan agreement, meticulously designed to protect the capital injection. I invited Lachlan and Isla to my home to review the documentation. I remember the evening vividly. The stack of papers sat on my heavy oak desk, a dense and intimidating presence in the room. Isla was visibly annoyed the moment she saw the document, her brow furrowing with a look of bored impatience. She scoffed, suggesting that families should not require such tedious, bureaucratic paperwork, and that my insistence on legal safeguards was an insult to our relationship. Lachlan laughed nervously, brushing off the document as an eccentric display of my old-school caution. He dismissed the hundreds of hours of work my lawyers had put into the text as overly dramatic retirement concerns. They were so incredibly eager to access the funds that they did not even bother to sit down properly. They flipped straight to the signature lines at the end of the document, their eyes darting past the legal clauses as if they were nothing more than necessary inconveniences between them and the deposit. They signed every page with a flourish of arrogance, completely oblivious to the fact that they were signing away the autonomy of their new business. They did not realize that the document contained restrictive covenants regarding the use of capital, asset allocation, and personal liability. They only cared about the certified cashier's check that was prepared to be transferred to their account. As they left my home that evening, smiling and talking about the interior design of the waiting room, I felt a heavy sense of foreboding. They had signed a legally binding senior secured loan agreement that granted me a comprehensive lien on every single asset the clinic would ever own, every chair, every monitor, and every dollar that passed through their accounts. They were blinded by the zeros on the check, unaware that they had just entered into a contract that gave me the power to dismantle their entire world if they deviated from the terms. I had placed the keys to their future in their hands, but I had kept the master key to the cage they were currently building around themselves. They believed they were embarking on a journey to elite status. In reality, they had just initiated a countdown to their own professional ruin. For 2 months, the updates from Lachlan and Isla were consistent in their vagueness. They cited minor permit issues with the Woollera Council and unavoidable supply chain delays as the primary reasons for the clinic's postponed opening. I accepted these explanations with the measured patience of a man who understands the complexities of commercial construction in Sydney's highly regulated districts. However, curiosity eventually dictated that I see the progress for myself. One Tuesday afternoon, I left my Vaucluse residence and drove to the medical district in Double Bay, expecting to find the standard reality of a build-out: drywall dust, exposed electrical wiring, and exhausted contractors working against a deadline. I parked my truck a block away and walked toward the address. What I encountered was not a construction zone, but a sleek, modern glass facade. A glowing brushed silver sign proudly displayed my son's full name in an elegant, minimalist font. In a reserved premium parking spot closest to the private rear entrance sat a brand-new slate-gray Porsche Panamera. The license plate was customized, bearing Isla's initials, a display of vanity that struck me as particularly egregious given the financial status of the business. I walked through the heavy glass doors, and the atmosphere was an immediate assault on my sensibilities. The interior was cool, climate-controlled, and permeated with a distinct, costly scent of imported eucalyptus diffusers. The waiting room was a masterclass in theatrical performance rather than medical necessity. It looked less like a dermatology practice and more like the lobby of a high-end boutique hotel. A reception desk, carved from a single, massive block of imported Italian marble, dominated the room. Plastered across the walls were plush velvet seating areas and a complimentary champagne bar, clearly designed to appeal to the local socialite demographic rather than patients seeking clinical care. A young receptionist, dressed in a tailored designer uniform that appeared more appropriate for a gala than a medical office, looked up from her computer and greeted me with a polished, rehearsed politeness. I asked her precisely how long the clinic had been operational. She smiled, clearly proud of the clinic's reception, and informed me that they had been fully open to the public for 6 weeks. 6 entire weeks. My initial shock was replaced by a cold, methodical clarity. I ignored the receptionist's confusion and walked down the pristine, white-tiled hallway toward the procedure rooms. Inside an empty treatment room, a high-tech medical laser sat in the corner. I stepped closer to inspect the metal back panel. There, bolted firmly to the plastic casing, was a standard lease tag from a corporate medical supply firm. I checked the next room, and then the next. The surgical chairs, the sterilization equipment, and the imaging monitors, everything was leased. The financial reality was immediately apparent. They had taken $900,000 in liquid capital, and rather than purchasing the essential assets to secure their business, they had leased everything to free up the cash. They had deliberately diverted the investment funds to finance their own luxury car, interior design, and exorbitant salaries before a single patient had even walked through the door. They had turned my lifetime of labor into a shallow, theatrical performance of wealth. I turned on my heel and walked out the rear exit, the cold, dark realization settling deep into my marrow. I did not speak to a soul in the clinic. There was nothing to be gained from a confrontation on their terms. I drove back to my house in Vaucluse in absolute silence. The radio remained off. I walked directly into my home office and sat at the heavy oak desk where I had spent decades negotiating multi-million-dollar development contracts with the most formidable figures in the Sydney property market. I picked up my phone and dialed Lachlan's personal number. He did not answer, as I had expected. The call rolled over to the clinic's administrative desk, and Isla picked up. Her voice was bright, artificial, and dripping with a practiced professional charm that she clearly intended for elite clientele. She recited the name of the dermatology practice, her tone suggesting that she was far too busy and important to be bothered by a simple inquiry. I did not greet her. I skipped the pleasantries entirely and asked her, point blank, about the grand opening of the clinic I had financed. I asked why I, the sole investor and the man who had sold a prime commercial asset to make this venture possible, had not been invited to witness the ribbon-cutting ceremony. I heard the sharp, instantaneous hesitation in her breath. For a fraction of a second, her composure faltered before her natural arrogance returned to mask the guilt. She let out a soft, condescending sigh. a sound I come to deeply despise in the months leading up to this moment. "Oh, the grand opening was 6 weeks ago, Warren," she said, her tone dripping with a false, patronizing apology. "We only invited close family and friends. You understand, it was an exclusive networking vibe for the local elite." The heavy, suffocating silence of my office seemed to amplify her words. Close family and friends. The man who had sold a significant portion of his own history and financial future to construct their reality was not considered close family. I was merely the silent bank, and the bank is never invited to the celebration party. In that tiny fraction of a second, the lingering grief of a father who had been desperately hoping for his son's recognition and love completely evaporated. The paternal warmth that had occupied my chest for 4 years was replaced by an icy, familiar clarity. The same clarity I had felt in my most ruthless days of business when faced with a bad faith contract. I did not scream at her through the phone. I did not list the sacrifices I had made for my son's tuition, his comfort, or his future. I did not demand my $900,000 back, for I knew that would only alert them to the urgency of my position. I simply hung up the phone. I placed the device down on the polished wood and folded my calloused hands. Lachlan and Isla truly believed they had easily outsmarted an irrelevant, aging man. They believed they could bleed my accounts dry and cast me aside into the shadows because they had foolishly confused my quiet, patient nature with weakness. They had forgotten who they were dealing with. The grieving father in me had died right there in that leather chair, but the businessman who had built an empire from concrete and steel had finally and permanently woken up. I did not call my son back. I did not drive to their townhouse to demand an explanation or to engage in a futile argument. Anger is a volatile, inefficient emotion that only alerts your adversary to your next move, and I had no intention of tipping my hand. Instead, I picked up the thick manila envelope containing the original 80-page operating agreement, walked out of my house, and climbed into my truck. The engine roared to life with a mechanical growl that felt perfectly aligned with the cold, calculated rhythm now beating in my chest. I drove directly toward the Sydney CBD, specifically to the law office of Simon Foster. Simon is a corporate attorney of formidable reputation, a man who has successfully navigated every legal battle I have waged over the past 30 years. He speaks entirely in facts and calculates every possible outcome before he even opens his mouth. As I navigated the traffic on the M1, my mind drifted back to the economic volatility of the past decades. I have seen proud, wealthy developers lose everything because they relied on handshakes and gentlemen's agreements rather than ironclad documentation. I survived those periods of slaughter for one reason. I never trusted anyone when it came to large sums of money. I protected my assets with complex, unforgiving contracts that left absolutely zero room for interpretation. That brutal lesson is the very reason I did not simply write a check to my son. I had structured the investment as a trap he was too arrogant to notice. I pulled into the parking garage of Simon's building and took the elevator to the 41st floor. The receptionist recognized me immediately and guided me into Simon's corner office, which overlooked the harbor. Simon was reviewing a complex merger file, but he looked up as soon as I entered. He saw the expression in my eyes, a look he had not witnessed in years, and he immediately stood up, closing his office door to ensure our privacy. I did not waste time with emotional grievances. I placed the thick contract on his glass desk and told him, calmly and succinctly, that the clinic in Double Bay had been fully operational for 6 weeks without my knowledge, and that every piece of medical equipment was under a third-party lease. Simon opened the file and adjusted his glasses. He flipped directly to Section 4, Paragraph B. He read the clause aloud. The capital injection was restricted, legally mandated for the outright purchase of medical assets to secure the loan. By choosing to lease the equipment and divert my capital to personal luxuries, Lachlan and Isla had committed a material breach of the core financial covenant. They had not just disrespected me as a father. They had legally defrauded a secured creditor. Simon looked up and asked how I wished to proceed, suggesting a formal warning letter or a freeze on their accounts. I shook my head, rejecting both. A warning would give them time to hide assets or secure a fraudulent bridge loan. Freezing the accounts today would merely alert them to the fact that I knew their secrets. I wanted them to remain comfortable, to believe they were untouchable, while I built an inescapable financial cage around them. I instructed Simon to keep his actions invisible and to initiate a quiet, comprehensive forensic audit of their corporate accounts. I wanted to know the name of every vendor they were failing to pay, every consulting fee they were paying themselves, and every cent they had siphoned from my retirement. Simon nodded, fully understanding the strategy. He warned me that once we weaponized the contract against my own son, there would be no returning to Sunday dinners. I looked out the window at the city skyline and felt only a profound sense of clarity. The line had been crossed months ago. I was simply preparing the necessary measures to ensure that they would never be able to cross it again. The forensic audit commenced in absolute secrecy the following morning. Simon did not hire a run-of-the-mill accountant. He engaged a former federal financial investigator, a specialist in dismantling complex corporate fraud and tracking hidden assets. Because our 80-page operating agreement granted me total unilateral authority as the senior secured creditor, Simon was able to serve a strict legal notice directly to the primary commercial bank holding the clinic's accounts. The bank, legally obligated to comply with the senior lien holder, immediately surrendered every transaction record, wire transfer, and credit card statement associated with the dermatology practice. Lachlan and Eastlaw remained entirely blind to this intrusion, too occupied with posing for photographs in their leased lobby to realize that the silent benefactor they had discarded was systematically mapping the blueprint of their financial ruin. 3 days later, Simon summoned me to his office. The weather in Sydney was bitterly cold, and a heavy, relentless rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows. I walked into his corner office and saw a thick, navy blue binder centered on his glass desk. The investigator had categorized every penny of my $900,000 with surgical precision. Simon did not offer comforting words. He knew I only cared for the undeniable evidence. He turned to the section outlining the daily patient logs and revenue streams. Lachlan was working incessantly, with the clinic booked from morning until night, yet the gross revenue figures were inexplicably low. Simon pointed to the billing records, revealing that Lachlan was utilizing the clinic as a vanity project, handing out massive discounts and providing thousands of dollars in free cosmetic treatments to socialites and internet influencers to gain social capital. He was effectively running a charity for the wealthy while his business bled to death. However, the true route was contained in the operating budget. Simon pointed his pen at a long column of recurring wire. Transfers leaving the clinic's account every week. These funds were not directed toward medical suppliers or utilities. They were funneled directly to an external entity called Apex Lifestyle Management. Simon had the investigator dig into the corporate registry. The results were as transparent as they were sickening. Apex Lifestyle Management was a shadow limited liability company registered only 2 months prior under Eastlaw's maiden name. She was the sole managing member and authorized signatory. She was billing the clinic $40,000 a month for fabricated services labeled as brand synergy consulting and atmospheric curation. I sat in total silence as I reviewed the personal bank statements the investigator had acquired. I saw the massive down payment for the slate gray Porsche. I saw weekly transactions for thousands of dollars at high-end designer boutiques in the Sydney CBD. I saw charges for lavish weekend spa retreats in the Blue Mountains. Eastlaw was burning through my life's work with reckless speed, fully convinced that the well of cash would never run dry. Simon turned to the final tab, showing the tragic consequence of her embezzlement. A dozen past-due notices from essential medical vendors. Eastlaw was starving the actual medical practice to feed her boundless vanity, ignoring the critical supplies required to operate the lasers. The clinic was functioning on borrowed time, and within a few weeks, the supply chain would collapse. Simon leaned back, explaining that we had enough evidence to instantly freeze the accounts and contact the authorities, but I shook my head. Arresting Isla now would be far too easy, and it would allow Lachlan to play the role of the innocent victim. I instructed Simon to keep the accounts open. I wanted them to continue their fraudulent wire transfers. I wanted them to feel entirely untouchable until the walls closed in. I needed them to witness their own destruction in real time, precisely as I had planned. The inevitable failure of the clinic was not a sudden explosion, but a meticulously orchestrated silence. Following my instructions, Simon reached out to the largest medical supplier on the past due list, Horizon Clinical Logistics. We negotiated the outright purchase of the distressed debt the clinic owed. By legally acquiring these $80,000 in past due invoices, I transitioned from being a passive senior investor to their primary operational creditor. I now held the power to decide exactly when the supply chain would be severed. I instructed Simon to have Horizon send one final automated notice regarding the account transfer, knowing full well that Isla would disregard it as another bureaucratic nuisance. She did, and in doing so, she authorized her final fraudulent wire transfer, completely unaware that she had just signed the death warrant of her own ambition. The consequence arrived exactly 11 days later, on a Tuesday, at 2 p.m. Simon's forensic team had been monitoring the clinic's public booking schedule, and I knew that a high-profile social media influencer with 3 million followers was arriving for a $10,000 proprietary laser treatment. Lachlan had promised this influencer a free session in exchange for a live video review from his imported Italian marble waiting room. He stood in his custom-tailored white coat, ready to perform, only to find the supply cabinets entirely empty. Isla, in her relentless pursuit of luxury, had ignored the final warnings, and the clinic's storeroom was barren. The ensuing crisis was immediate and absolute. Lachlan, faced with the prospect of canceling on a high-profile client in front of his staff, attempted a pathetic, fabricated excuse regarding a mechanical failure with a laser. The influencer, however, was not interested in excuses. She had rearranged her busy schedule for this promotion and viewed the cancellation as a personal insult. She did not raise her voice in the procedure room. She simply walked into the opulent, velvet-draped waiting room, pulled out her phone, and broadcasted her absolute disgust to her millions of followers. Sitting in my home in Vaucluse, I watched the live video appear on my laptop screen as she dismantled my son's reputation in under 60 seconds. She described the clinic as a disorganized, fraudulent joke, warning her wealthy followers to avoid Lachlan at all costs. While the digital firestorm raged online, the physical confrontation exploded within the clinic's administrative office. Simon received live alerts from the banking monitoring tools we had installed. Lachlan, finally stripped of his professional detachment, stormed into the office to confront Isla. The veneer of their unified front shattered instantly. Lachlan demanded to know why the supply cabinets were empty and why he had been forced to humiliate himself. Isla, cornered by her own embezzlement, could not admit to her crimes. She lied, blaming a clerical banking error and the incompetence of the medical supply company. It was a desperate, transparent fabrication, but Lachlan, paralyzed by the fear of his ruined reputation, chose to believe her because the alternative, the truth of her betrayal, was too devastating to acknowledge. He ordered her to resolve the banking issue and rushed back out to attempt damage control, leaving Isla in the office, suffocating in her own web of deceit. The trap I had laid was closing, and for the first time, the pressure was no longer external. It was consuming them from within. Desperation, I have learned, often serves as a catalyst for catastrophic stupidity. Isla, realizing that traditional avenues for emergency capital were closed to her due to the clinic's abysmal credit standing, turned to the predatory underbelly of Sydney's alternative lending sector. She contacted a notoriously aggressive group specializing in high-risk bridge loans, organizations that operate like institutional loan sharks in tailored suits. These entities provide immediate liquidity to failing businesses, but the interest rates are astronomical and the collateral requirements are brutal. Simon, who had been monitoring the clinic's credit inquiries with the precision of a hawk, alerted me the moment Isla submitted her online application. He found the audacity of her plan almost humorous. She was applying for a $150,000 emergency loan entirely behind Lachlan's back, going so far as to forge his digital signature to bypass the requirement for dual authorization. She was committing identity theft against her own spouse in a desperate, last-ditch effort to cover the hole in the clinic's accounts left by her own embezzlement. The collateral she offered was, predictably, her undoing. To secure the loan, she pledged the entire clinic's inventory, including the Italian marble desk and the surgical lasers, as unencumbered corporate assets. She remained willfully oblivious to the 80-page operating agreement she had signed on my dining table, which explicitly designated me as the senior secured lien holder on every piece of equipment and every future dollar of revenue the practice would ever generate. She could not legally pledge assets that were either leased from my company or encumbered by my primary lien. It was not merely a breach of contract, it was a federal crime. I watched from my kitchen as Simon explained the details over the phone. I did not feel a flicker of pity. I instructed Simon to allow the predatory lender to proceed with their due diligence. I wanted Isla to taste the phantom relief of an impending approval, to feel the brief, intoxicating surge of victory before I shattered her reality entirely. The guillotine was already rigged, and she had effectively placed her own neck beneath the blade. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the Sydney skyline, Simon called to deliver the final act. In the cutthroat world of high-risk finance, lenders do not gamble. They conduct comprehensive due diligence. The underwriter for the lending group had performed a universal commercial code search and immediately discovered that a senior secured lien was already active on every single asset of the clinic. The underwriter had contacted Simon's firm, as he was listed as the registered legal agent for the lien holder, to inquire if we would subordinate our position. Simon, of course, refused. He then informed the underwriter that the medical equipment Isla had pledged was leased property that the clinic did not own. The reaction from the lender was instantaneous and furious. They viewed her attempt to pledge non-owned assets as a severe case of wire fraud. They did not just deny the loan. They flagged her corporate entity in the commercial system and prepared to report the attempted fraud to the National Commercial Fraud Registry. I knew then that the final barrier to their downfall had been removed. She was no longer just a failing manager. She was a criminal who had finally run out of places to hide. The following morning, the sun barely crested the horizon when the aggressive sound of tires tearing across my gravel driveway shattered the morning silence. I was in my kitchen, preparing my breakfast with a deliberate, rhythmic pace. I did not need to glance out the window to confirm the identity of my visitors. The heavy slamming of car doors echoed through the air, followed by the frantic, uneven thud of footsteps storming toward the front door. They did not wait for an invitation. The brass knob turned violently, and the door swung open, bringing the cold, bitter energy of their panic into my home. Lachlan and Isla marched into the kitchen, their faces pale and eyes wild with the exhaustion of a night spent watching their empire evaporate. Lachlan looked diminished. His expensive designer shirt was wrinkled, and the polished, arrogant medical visionary I once knew had been replaced by a man coming undone at the seams. Beside him, Isla stood like a cornered animal, her makeup smudged and her hands clutching a designer bag so tightly that her knuckles were white. Lachlan did not offer a greeting. He immediately descended into a theatrical display of emotional manipulation, screaming about his destroyed reputation and the viral video that had decimated his patient list. He accused me of orchestrating his downfall, labeling me a bitter, resentful old man who could not stand to see his son achieve professional success. When the accusations failed to provoke an emotional reaction, he reached for the ultimate weapon, the memory of his late mother. He asked me, with a calculated, pathetic whisper, how I could possibly look at myself in the mirror knowing I was destroying the only child she had ever loved. A few months prior, those words would have been a dagger to my heart. But the father who had blindly loved that boy had ceased to exist the moment I was excluded from the life I had financed. I looked at Lachlan and felt nothing but a cold, clinical pity. I saw him for what he was, a weak man desperately wielding a memory to secure a financial bailout. Before he could continue, Isla stepped forward, discarding the emotional facade for a display of faux legal aggression. She threatened to sue me for tortious interference, claiming I had sabotaged her bridge loan. She demanded that I apologize to the lender and sign over the clinic, promising that if I complied, she would be generous enough to drop the lawsuit. I listened to her unhinged demands, standing in my kitchen, and for a moment, I almost laughed at the magnitude of her delusion. She truly believed that her designer bag and loud voice could bully a man who had navigated the most ruthless boardrooms in Sydney for 40 years. I set my coffee mug down, and the house fell into an absolute, suffocating silence. I raised a calloused hand, signaling for their silence, and spoke in a voice low and dangerously steady. I told them that the time for temper tantrums had ended. I told them they were going to listen to how the real world operates. I turned my back on them and walked toward my home office, knowing they would follow, as they were now utterly without options. I had spent 40 years building an empire, and I was about to show them exactly what happens when you decide to steal from a man who writes the rules of destruction. The atmosphere in my home office was starkly different from the rest of the house. This was a room designed for strategy, not sentiment. I sat behind my heavy oak desk, and for the first time, I felt no obligation to play the role of the indulgent patriarch. Lachlan and Isla stood on the other side, appearing like two guilty children summoned to an authority they could no longer manipulate. I did not waste time with small talk. I placed 3 thick manila folders on the desk and opened the first one, sliding the 80-page operating agreement toward my son. I calmly explained that he had never truly owned his clinic. He had been the temporary custodian of a business legally bound to my senior secured lien. I pointed to the default clause he had ignored, explaining that by leasing the equipment rather than purchasing it, he had triggered a catastrophic breach of contract. The color drained from his face as the legal weight of his choices finally settled upon him. I then reached for the second folder, filled with the forensic audit reports. I pushed these documents toward Isla. Her composure crumbled instantly. I walked them through the wire transfers to Apex Lifestyle Management, detailing every dollar she had siphoned from the clinic's operating budget to fund her designer wardrobe, the slate gray Porsche, and her lavish retreats. I did not raise my voice, but each sentence cut through the room with surgical precision. I laid out her personal bank statements alongside the fraudulent invoices she had created. Lachlan, finally realizing that his wife's ambition was the very thing that had bankrupted his future, turned on her with a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The unified front of their shared greed disintegrated, replaced by a vicious, panicked scramble for self-preservation. I did not let them argue for long. I opened the third and final folder, revealing the official commercial foreclosure notices. I informed them that as the senior secured creditor, I had formally exercised my right to seize total legal ownership of the dermatology practice, the building lease, and every remaining asset inside the Double Bay facility. Isla tried one last time to claim the emergency bridge loan would save them, but I smiled, a cold, genuine expression, and told her that the lending group had already denied her application, flagged her for federal fraud, and contacted my legal team. The reality that the trap was of her own making finally paralyzed her. I told them their time was finished. I informed them that even as we stood in this office, my legal team and local law enforcement were at the clinic in Double Bay, changing the locks and taping the foreclosure notices to the glass front doors. I gave them exactly 10 minutes to pack their personal belongings, keys, phones, and nothing else before I called the police for trespassing. They looked at me, not with the arrogance of the elite, but with the hollow gaze of the defeated, as they realized their empire was nothing more than an expensive, temporary illusion. The worst part of their nightmare began. The realization that they were now facing a federal criminal investigation for wire fraud and embezzlement. Without the shield of their wealth, they were exposed to the full, uncompromising force of the law, and I watched with complete detachment as their shared life dissolved into the wreckage of their own making. The weeks following the foreclosure were a masterclass in the unyielding efficiency of the legal system. I remained in Vaucluse, watching from a distance as the lives of my son and his wife unraveled with clinical inevitability. The federal financial investigation into the embezzlement scheme was relentless. The evidence we had gathered was, by design, airtight. Lachlan, once the darling of the Double Bay social circuit, found himself utterly radioactive within the medical community. The viral video from the humiliated influencer had stained his professional name beyond repair, and no private practice would risk their reputation by hiring a doctor whose career was synonymous with professional negligence and scandal. To avoid total insolvency and the permanent revocation of his medical license, Lachlan was forced to accept a grueling, entry-level position at a public health clinic in the far western suburbs of Sydney. The transition from the opulence of his fake life to the stark, fluorescent-lit reality of public service was absolute. He spent his days treating dermatological infections in an overcrowded facility, his salary a mere fraction of his former lifestyle. It was there, amidst the sterile smell of cheap disinfectant, that I finally encountered him one afternoon. I had driven past simply to observe. I saw him standing under a buzzing light, his expensive watch long gone, his hands trembling slightly as he prepped a patient who could barely afford the consultation fee. In that moment, the arrogance was gone, replaced by a haunting, hollow exhaustion. He looked up, saw me in the distance, and for a fleeting second, his eyes filled with a desperate, crushing awareness of everything he had traded for vanity. He did not approach me. He simply turned back to his work, a man finally learning that dignity is not a gift, but a burden earned through years of labor. Isla's downfall, however, remained devoid of such clarity. With her assets frozen, the luxury Porsche was repossessed, and her designer belongings were seized as part of the investigation. She eventually filed for divorce, hoping to extract a settlement from Lachlan, but she had neglected the ironclad prenuptial agreement I had insisted upon years earlier. That document, drafted to protect my legacy, proved impenetrable. When she marched into the mediation room expecting a payout, she was met with the reality that she was entitled to nothing, not a cent of his salary, and certainly none of my assets. The look of cold, calculating shock on her face as the attorney read the finality of the contract was the most satisfying moment of this entire ordeal. She walked out of the room empty-handed, stepping onto a cold Sydney street with no status, no resources, and no future. She was not a victim. She was a predator who had finally run out of prey. The clinic in Double Bay remained dark for 2 months, a silent monument to their hubris. I did not sell the property at a loss. Instead, I treated it as I had every other development in my 40-year career. I cleared away the debris, kept the infrastructure, and searched for tenants who understood the sanctity of hard work. I eventually leased the facility to a group of 3 brilliant, first-generation medical graduates who had been working in a corporate hospital, crushed under the weight of student debt. When I handed them the keys, I saw the genuine respect in their eyes, the same respect my own flesh and blood had discarded in favor of hollow status. They did not want champagne bars or imported marble. They wanted the opportunity to build a practice based on integrity. Today, the first of every month, I sit in my home office and watch the automated rent payment clear my account. It is a steady, secure return on an investment that once nearly cost me my peace of mind. The clinic is thriving, not as a vanity project, but as a place of genuine healing. I no longer harbor anger toward Lachlan or Isla that have effectively vanished from my world, existing only as cautionary tales in my memory. As I sit by the window, sipping coffee and watching the Sydney skyline glow in the twilight, I feel a profound, stable calm. The ledger of my life is finally balanced. I did not win a war. I simply restored order. The glass castle they built is gone, but the foundation of my own life, built on decades of labor, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to the truth, remains undisturbed. Justice, I have found, is not just about the final ruling. It is about the quiet, absolute satisfaction of knowing that the architect of your destruction often ends up trapped in the very house of cards they built for themselves.